Is a cheap B-series Falcon really worth your money in 2024? Over here is my 2007 BF Mark II XR6, and I do think it's worth your money. Now, the first point I want to make with B-series Falcons is that they are great value for your money. I used to be a big believer in just buy an AU or just spend a little bit more and get an FG. I've owned an AU, I own an E-series currently, and I've driven heaps of FG Falcons. I have to say, for the money, this thing performs better than both of those. I have owned this particular car for around 3 weeks, and I am so surprised with the way it drives. Although it is just a BTR XR6 POV pack, nothing special, not a gear, not a Fairmont or anything special like that. This drives better than an AU, and it drives better than an FG in my opinion. So the first point I want to make with this BF here is that it is a very balanced car. It's not only comfortable, it handles really well, and it's really plants on the road in terms of there's not a lot of road noise, and if you want to chuck it into a corner you can. If you want to drift it, they drift really well as well. Ask me how I know. I would put this right in the middle of an FG and an AU. Now obviously that sounds very self-explanatory. I mean, this is right in between an AU and an FG. It's got the best of both worlds. B-series FG rear subframe, and it's got the AU BF front subframe, which I think makes it a lot lighter on its feet compared to an FG. Now, there's something about Falcons that I just can't put my finger on, and it's the way they drive, in the sense that they were designed for Australian roads. I mean, they were built in Campbellfield. A car that's built, designed and tested here is obviously going to have an advantage over manufacturers that import their cars. Now, me personally, I do about 1,000 to 2,000 Ks a week, and I am so surprised about how well this thing drives and how well it sits on the road. This thing on stock suspension and pretty average tires can get out of its own wake, basically, which is really good. Now, people make a lot of memes about how unreliable the front suspension on these cars are, how the lower ball joints fall out, the upper ball joints knock. Now, my car is no exception. The upper ball joints are on their way out. It is knocking, but it still doesn't prevent it from handling the road really well. And I can't stress enough how surprised I was. And I was always a big believer in, oh, you know, AUs are the best. You know, they handle well, they've got a solid rear end, they're reliable. After owning this thing for about 2 or 3 weeks, I've completely changed my mind. I spent $3.5 grand on this car. I would rather own an average BF Falcon than a nice AU. Now, if you're in the market for a cheap daily Falcon, you're going to be looking at AUs, you're going to be looking at FGs, maybe even E-series if you game enough. The Barra motor, I know everyone raves on about them and how good they are. It is honestly a really fantastic motor. Even this mediocre NA with 266,000 kilometers on it still gets up and goes. It runs like a clock. It's dead silent. We have an audience. Are you gonna attack me? Anyway, both of my 2 daily cars that I've owned in the past, they were both 6 cylinders. Both of my parents' cars are 4 cylinders. You can't beat a straight 6, especially for the money. Once again, I paid $3.5 grand for this thing. I know you can find cheaper ones. One thing I noticed on these long drives and having a Barra is that I don't feel tired. Now, that might seem really weird. Like, why would you get tired of a motor? When you're in a car with a small engine, I find it extremely taxing because you have to put your foot down everywhere for it to go anyway, and you're super stressed out about having to overtake people. Not with this thing. This thing is effortless. Even with that 4-speed BTR gearbox, it overtakes cars effortlessly. You don't have to floor it to get up to the speed limit or floor it onto on-ramps. It's very brisk. It just moves away. It accelerates nicely. Now, moving on to the interior, probably one of my favorite parts about this car. Now, everyone complains about how shit B-series interiors are, and I agree with them. They're not put together very well, I must admit, but I still think it's put together better than an AU. A good mix of modern technology and classic reliability. Overall, the interior is a very nice place to be. The seats are super comfortable. Before this car, I was actually driving around my mum's 2024 Subaru Crosstrek and that thing's fully loaded, leather, everything, I much prefer this. That thing has radar, cruise, and lane keep and all this fancy stuff. Don't need any of that. I feel more comfortable and less tired in this car than I do in that car because this thing is just not taxing the drive. If you own a Falcon, you get what I'm talking about. Maybe Commodores are the same. I've never owned a Commodore. If you own a Commodore, leave a comment down below if it's sort of the same thing. Now, like I said before, I always was under the impression that AUs are the best bang for buck when it comes to driving and comfort. And I always had this sour taste in my mouth about B-series. I'm like, oh, they're crap, you know, their front suspension, this and that, blah, 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 diff bushes. Until I drove one. And until I bought this car, I never really drove any B-series Falcons. I definitely do not regret buying this thing because it drives so well. It's so effortless to accelerate, even up to the speed limit. This isn't a turbo, this is just an NA, and it's so good. Maybe my expectations are really low, but for $3.5 grand, it's definitely worth every penny. Now, obviously, we need to talk about the elephant in the room. The BTR gearbox, of course. That was a massive problem for me when I first bought this car. I'm like, I hate this gearbox, it's crap, it's dim-witted, and yes, it's not the best gearbox by any means. I think it's actually, you know, one of the worst gearboxes I've ever driven, other than CVTs. But because they use this gearbox in many other models of Falcons, they got it pretty down pat. And the reason why these gearboxes get such a bad rap is because of lack of maintenance, people abusing them. Obviously, if you don't service a gearbox, it's going to give you a hard time. This one seems to have been looked after pretty well. It does have its moments. It does feel like it has a shift kit sometimes, but it's all right. Like, once again, for the money, you can't go wrong. When you put your foot down, it listens, it downshifts, and it just goes. I really like this car. Well, I completely forgot to conclude the video, but thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys found the video even somewhat informative. I know I've learned a lot about B-series Falcons owning my one. I would definitely buy another one again. Maybe a better one. Definitely in the future though. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.